But good afternoon. Those of you who have been able to go the distance today, thank you for your presence this afternoon. My name is Mike Moses, and I'm pleased to be able to be at this table with these gentlemen, these esteemed gentlemen, as we talk about education and business leaders' views about our upcoming session. Like all of your other presenters, the bios are in the program today. We appreciate Dr. Murdoch, certainly appreciate the Baker Institute and the Hobby Center for putting on the program today and for the opportunity to be here. I think we have some interesting perspectives from our panelists, presenters. If it's all right with them, I think we'll just speak from this table, but if anyone would like to use the podium, they're welcome to do so. As far as introductions go, the gentleman to my left and to your right is the Chancellor of the Texas A&M University System, Mr. John Sharp. John's had a distinguished career in Texas, serving as the Texas Comptroller of Public Accounts, where he audited me a few times and wanted to audit me a few more times, probably. But did a stellar job. He's a former member of the Texas Senate, Texas House of Representatives, and graduate of Texas A&M, former president student body, and as I say, has enjoyed a distinguished career as a public servant in Texas. The gentleman immediately to my right is Mr. John Monford, likewise a great Texan who formerly was district attorney in Lubbock, was a member of the Texas Senate for 14 years, representing the district, I believe it's District 28, Senator, is that correct? Or I could also call him Chancellor, because from the Senate he went on to become Chancellor of the Texas Tech University System. From there he went to work as a senior executive with AT&T. From there he went to work as a senior executive with General Motors. And so John brings a unique perspective of having served in the Texas Senate, having been Chancellor of a major university system, and also having worked for 2 Fortune 500 companies. Immediately to my far right is David Thompson. David is an attorney with his firm, Thompson & Horton. Formerly, he was a member of the law firm with Bracewell and Giuliani. David has had a great career representing school districts, community colleges, universities, all types of educational law. He's been involved also as a former general counsel at the Texas Education Agency, worked also at the Texas Association of School Boards. David currently is one of the lead attorneys in the lawsuit regarding school finance. David is the attorney who successfully argued the case previously in front of the Texas Supreme Court. So we have, I think, some great people here to talk about both higher education and public education. We're going to start with higher education, and I'm going to ask Chancellor Sharp to bring comments, and we'll just go around the table, and then I think we'll be able to touch most of the issues in both higher ed and public ed, and then we'll allow time for questions at the conclusion of comments. So, Chancellor, thank you for being here, and you've got the floor. Appreciate you.
Thank you, Mike. Well, I had a red letter day 2 or 3 days ago. I got to introduce Perry and Dewhurst both at a function which marks the first time in Texas history somebody got to introduce both guys that beat him on the same stage. So that was pretty fun. But I want to talk about just a couple of things. One is, obviously, higher ed took a pretty big hit in the last legislative session, 11% for most public universities. And the way, and you will forgive me if I don't say, if I say some good things about A&M and forget the others. It's just the time constraints that'll keep me from saying things about the others. But we view the recession as our friend, and the reason for that is, number one, we don't have any choice, and number two, we think we can do some things at A&M that perhaps other universities around the country can't do. One of the things that's happening around the country is, particularly in California, maybe even more particularly in California after the November bond election there, if it fails, and Indiana, some other places are having a pretty tough time keeping professors. They're having a tough time keeping the commitments they've made to great researchers to come to their universities, or not following through with those. And we hear about that pretty regularly. And so we think this is a pretty good time if you can put together a pot of money to go steal is a harsh word, recruit some of those folks into Texas, and thus their research dollars, whether they're NIH or wherever, with them. And so we took some controversial steps. We privatized our food service, we privatized our building maintenance and landscaping, and we're not done. And that produced about $260 million for us, $45 million of which we will receive this week, on an enterprise that was losing $1.5 million a year before. We took that money and created a $100 million fund, and that $100 million fund over a couple-year period of time is going to be used for one-time payments and for lab work and things like that to bring those professors here, and the rest will be used to pay them once we get here. They're not cheap people. They're not inexpensive people. And so we think that now we have to be a lot more aggressive. We believe that we're there for two reasons. We're there because of what happens in the classroom and what happens in the labs, and everything else, chancellor included, is almost is just there to support the core functions of the university. And so if we can save money from everything that doesn't happen in the classroom and doesn't happen in research, and then funnel it toward that, that's what we're going to do. And so that's why you hear a few folks gnashing of teeth and things like that occur in College Station, because that's exactly what we're going to do and going to continue to do. And we look at everything from parking and others. The debate that I think is going to occur in higher education soon, and that has started, actually, you're starting to read a little bit of it in the paper from the governor, from Dan Branch and others, on funding higher education with outputs as opposed to inputs. If you look at it, it's pretty simple. If you look at the two major rating agencies of college universities, or the magazines, one is U.S. News and World Report, the other one is Washington Monthly. Obviously, U.S. News is more well known because it's a bigger magazine, but Washington Monthly puts just as much effort. But one uses inputs, one uses outputs. U.S. News is almost exclusively inputs. I mean, for instance, what's your faculty-student ratio? How much do you spend on faculty? What's the size of your endowment? What do other members of the academy think of you? What do high school counselors think of you, and stuff like that? Washington Monthly does it a little bit different. Washington Monthly goes almost nothing on input. How much do your graduates make when they graduate? Of course, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that A&M was number 3 in the nation in terms of average starting salaries, and their salaries 7 years after they graduate. They ask you questions like, what does the business community think of you, rather than what do your fellow members of the academy think of you. Wall Street Journal did an article about 2 months ago that said that the Fortune 500 company headhunters, the number 2 place in the nation that they go to is within the Texas A&M University system, because the work ethic or whatever reasons they use. And they ask questions like, not just what do they make. For instance, a good example is departments of education. A lot of universities, when they get big and famous, quit education because they think it's beneath them, or for whatever reason. We will never do that, because we think educating teachers for public schools is one of the most important things we can ever do. And one of the outputs that they look at that is that, because one of the problems Mike had when he was commissioner of education and head of the Dallas School District was teacher retention. How many of your teachers are still teaching at the end of 5 years? The state average is less than 50%. A&M average is 80% after 7 years. So they sort of stick to it, and they use those kinds of things. And so when the governor asked the question the other day, and Dan Branch and some of them, hey, what do y'all think about going to outputs? We go, okay, don't throw me in that briar patch. We're for it 100%, because we rank well, obviously, in U.S. News, but in Washington Monthly, we're number 2 in the nation. Last year, we were number 1 in the nation in terms of outputs and what comes. Now, I wish I could say that was all what happened in the classroom, and certainly part of it is, but it's just a culture. It's a culture of giving back. It's a culture of the kind of students that come to A&M. All you have to do is go to a Friday night football game, yell practice, and wonder why 40,000 kids are there at midnight practicing yelling for the next game. They have a bit of spirit to them. And so I think before we're over with, I mean, Branch yesterday, I think the governor called for 10% funding for higher education based on that. Branch said 25, would rather go to 50 if he could. We support that 100%, and we think that's going to be a big debate, particularly in a recession when business is asking the question of, you know, that you can't afford to hire the wrong folks. It becomes too expensive, and those are the questions that business asks, and generally the state and the federal government tends to follow those outputs when it happens.
Thank you very much. Great comments. John, you've seen it from all angles, from the Senate chamber to the institution, from the business side. So your comments, please, sir.
Well, I couldn't help but think, listening to the presenters this morning, and this January when the legislature convenes, 30 years ago, I reported in, I think it was on January 11th of 1983 as a freshman. I think, John, you came over from the House that year in that class. Our big three challenges that we faced in 1983 were public school finance and education, water and transportation. I'd say we're probably at the top of the list. So some things never change. You just have to keep on going. I have had the privilege of seeing, I think, higher education in Texas from a number of different perspectives. When I was at General Motors for 2 years, head of public policy, and on the executive committee, I had the privilege of, I had a responsibility for 122 countries, and let me tell you, in looking at what I've seen with my own eyes, we've got a great system of higher education in Texas. I think sometimes we sort of have to stop and pause and say, well, really, where are we in terms of opportunity? And if you look at this state, we have some tremendous opportunities in higher education, and it spans across the state. I would have preferred it if A&M would have stayed in the Big 12. I hated to see them secede from Texas, but you know, it looks to me like that may now be a smart decision the way things are going. But I do think we sometimes, you know, people gripe a lot about all different aspects of higher ed, but when you compare us relative to the rest of the world and what we have in Texas, we've got a good thing going, and I do believe that our opportunity with a quality system of higher education buttressed by a solid system of public education and the private components as we know them are so vitally important to the future of Texas. One thing that sort of stands out in my previous, say, 10 years experience in the private sector is the critically important factor of having a skilled workforce for Texas as well as this country to be competitive. I couldn't help but think when I was at AT&T and I'd sometimes go out on runs with the technicians, even a baseline technician these days in telecommunications has to be proficient with personal computers. I mean, it's totally transitioned into high tech, and we had challenges relative to training, preparation, and I also on the assembly line at General Motors, it is high tech now, and most of those employees that come in have at least a high school education or equivalency. But I do think for this country to remain competitive, and I think Texas is a major contributor to national success, we have to focus and continue to focus on turning out a quality, skilled workforce. So part of my, I guess, overview of where I've come from and where I've been is, and looking back, I think I have a renewed appreciation of what the community colleges do as a part of this system of higher education, I think it is indispensable that we as a nation have to ratchet up our manufacturing, delivery, and capability, and that skilled workforce is such a vital component of our success. So those are a couple of observations. My wife is now a Texas Tech regent, and I get a lot of pillow talk. Fortunately, not being in a budget writing capacity anymore, I sort of get perceptive about it. But I would just throw out one word of caution. I know everybody wants to freeze tuition, and everybody wants to cut budgets, but at some point, the budget compresses where you just simply can't do both. And I think they've been able to raise tuition, and I like, you know, I'm a product, as I imagine some of my people on stage today, I'm a product of $50 tuition, pure and simple, and I haven't extrapolated that to 2012, but I would expect to be about $600. I hope we never lose sight of the fact in Texas that I think our higher education system does extend the hand of opportunity. Let's don't price ourselves out of the market. So, thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, John. Appreciate the comments. We'll switch gears from the higher education scene to public education, and there are plenty of issues to talk about there, and we might. I think I'll wait, David, and touch on maybe the testing and accountability and the parental choice pieces, and let you talk about the school finance pieces, because I think that's David, as I've already mentioned, has spent a great deal of time on this and has been actively involved for the last few weeks deposing witnesses for the case, which will start October 22nd. But I think there's no one better to give us an update and on this case and what David sees as we go down the road of litigation and school finance. David?
Well, thanks, Mike, and I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today, and I particularly want to say to Chancellor Sharp and Chancellor Montford, I am a particular appreciator right now of higher education. I have two children in college at the same time, and so I'm very much aware of those tuition bills. I have a senior this year and an entering freshman, so I'm definitely a consumer of our higher education, and I appreciate the opportunities we have there, and I appreciated your comments. Tamara and I live here in Houston. My wife thinks I've moved over the last month. She's not real sure where, but she thinks I've moved because we've been preparing for litigation, and we've been doing 2 to 3 depositions just about every day. I had a deposition this morning and just drove in time for this panel. I will give you just a little perspective on our public school system in Texas, just to kind of frame the conversation a little bit. This year, we are going to top 5 million children in our public schools in Texas. Now, to put that in perspective, every other combined form of elementary, secondary education in Texas, whether it's charter schools, classic private and parochial schools, home schools, whatever other forms exist combined, are a little less than 500,000. So well over 90% of our children in Texas are in our traditional public schools. Our traditional public school population over the last 5 years has grown annually at an average rate of 84,000 students a year. That is equivalent to adding a Fort Worth ISD every year to the state of Texas. That's what growth is like. It varies a little bit from year to year. It can be in the mid-upper 70s to well over 100,000 children we added one year when our neighbors to the east, Louisiana, experienced Hurricane Katrina. And we had like 120,000 student growth in Texas in 1 year. So we're a growing state, and that's you know, I talk to people from other states. I'd much rather have our problems than their problems. Growth stresses our system, but I think it's something we can handle as Texans. We also have a changing student population. This year, 60% of our kids are going to be from low-income homes. 20 years ago, that was 40%. It's growing at a rate of 1% a year. Why is that important? Because every single statistic you look at, there is a closer correlation between socioeconomic status of the home and educational success of students than any other single factor. Why? Because that socioeconomic status is a pretty good proxy for income, for educational level in the home and for stability in the home. So that population's growing. Our bilingual population is also growing. Kids who have needs beyond just kind of classic middle class backgrounds are accounting for most of the growth in our schools. We are also raising standards in Texas, and as someone whose youngest child just graduated from high school, I would say I'm 100% in support of that. I think Texas has been a leader for a number of years in incrementally raising our standards. We've now set as a standard post-secondary readiness, either for college or community college or for the workforce as our objective. And that's definitely what we need to be working toward. But at the same time that we have a growing, changing population and increasing standards, what did we do in 2011? We cut $5.4 billion out of state support for public schools. We cut an average of over $500 per child per year out of state funding for public schools. And put that in perspective, if you have a class of 22 children and an average cut of a little over $500 per child per year, that's an average cut equivalent to over $11,000 per classroom per year, at the same time that we're growing and raising standards. So that's a little bit of background. And that's why we are having, in the last 25, 28 years, our 7th round of school finance litigation in Texas. The current lawsuit is set to go to trial October 22nd in district court in Travis County. Trial will probably last 7 to 8 weeks. There will definitely be an appeal to the Supreme Court at some point. The legislature historically has not responded to a trial court decision. Frankly, that makes perfect sense. I wouldn't if I were them either. I would wait and see what the Supreme Court has to say. And I think that's where this case will eventually wind up. Out of the previous 6 cases that have gotten to the Supreme Court, the state has won exactly 1 on a 5-4 vote. So the state's record is not very good. And the reason is because we don't do a lot of things very well related to public school finance. So what are the issues in the lawsuit? Just in real quick terms, Mike, and then I'll pass it back to you. Look at Article 7, Section 1 of the Texas Constitution. And Article 7 deals with education, not only public education, elementary, secondary, but that's where you find the constitutional provisions related to community colleges, higher education, A&M, UT, etc. And the very first words in our Constitution, which we have not changed since 1876, are these: a general diffusion of knowledge being essential to the preservation of the liberties and rights of the people, comma. I will stop right there. That notion that an educated citizenry and a healthy society, that those two things are connected, is a very Jeffersonian idea that you find in many state constitutions. That's why we have public schools in Texas. That's why we have public universities in Texas. That's the rationale. If you look at Article 7, Section 1, after that statement, there is a comma, and it says, "It shall be the duty of the legislature of the state to establish and suitably provide for an efficient system of public free schools. So a lot of the argument is over some of the devil's always in the details, and so we argue about, well, just exactly what does general diffusion of knowledge mean? How high is the bar? Is that a low bar? Is it a high bar? What is efficiency anyway? What does suitable provision mean? Some people want to argue about what's a system of public free schools. You know, are vouchers part of a system of public free schools? So those are some of the debates that occur. In very simple terms, the lawsuits are going to focus on a connection between what it is we want to accomplish and the means to accomplish that objective. And let me just ask a quick question here. How many of you have ever built a house? The fun part of building a house is the design phase. You get to meet with your architect, put all your thoughts, all your heart into your plans, cut pictures out of Architectural Digest or Southern Living or wherever you get your inspiration, and you fall in love with your plans. And then one pretty important day comes. You have to sit down with your builder and ask one fairly important question. Do my plans match my budget? If they don't, you have a problem. You can't just wish it away. Sooner or later, what you're trying to accomplish and the means to that end have to match up. And that's really a lot of what this lawsuit is about. We do spend a great deal of money on public education in Texas, and that's undeniable. Part of it's because we have a lot of kids, but we spend money. But that connection between what it is we're trying to accomplish and the means to that goal is sort of at the heart of what a lot of the litigation's about. There's a feeling that in the decision-making process, those decisions have gotten disconnected. That we're setting standards over here, we're falling in love with blueprints independent from the budget setting process, and that disconnect is not a recipe for success. So we'll go to trial October 22nd. I do expect we will eventually make our way to the Supreme Court, and we'll see how that plays out. Through that whole process, the court isn't going to fix this. Ultimately, the resolution is back with our elected officials in the legislature, and so we'll look forward to working with those individuals too at the appropriate time. Mike, back to you.
Thanks, David. By the way, this question was asked today. How many districts are involved in the lawsuit?
All total right now, well over 600, close to 2/3 of all the school districts in the state that collectively represent or educate 75% of all the children are involved as plaintiffs in this lawsuit. We represent Houston, Dallas, Austin, Fort Worth, Katy, Cypress, Fairbanks, Fort Bend ISD, Pasadena, Pearland, Round Rock, et cetera, et cetera. Our group is mostly the larger suburban and urban centers all over the state of Texas. And by the way, Mike, one individual in this room, Steve Murdoch, is going to be a featured witness here in a very few days. He will be one of the key witnesses in the lawsuit because of the research that he's done over the years about the connection between an educated citizenry and what that means from an economic and societal context for Texas. So, Steve, I hope you're prepped. So,
well, I think that's a great summary. I'll make 3 or 4 brief comments. I think other issues that will be before the legislature that where public schools are concerned will be probably testing and accountability. Just as David mentioned, 600 districts have gotten involved in the lawsuit. Another 700 districts have passed resolutions asking for the testing program in Texas to be examined and to be reviewed. I think that's something obviously that is of great concern because of reports of school districts spending 30 or 40 days a year testing students. As someone who worked pretty closely with a testing and accountability system, I personally think that measurement is good for youngsters. I think we need to diagnose and we need to find out where children are, and we need to take whatever corrective action is needing. So I'm not sure what needs to be done in the testing area. I will say where accountability is concerned, we have about 3 accountability systems that Texas schools are exposed to every year. They get rated in January by a program known as the Public Education Grant System. They get the release of the state test scores in June, and they get the release of the federal No Child Left Behind results known as Adequate Yearly Progress in August each year. So if there needs to be accountability, then I think there does. An alignment certainly would be something worthy of a discussion. Testing in of itself is not a bad thing, but I think in Texas we have been a leader in that area. It's a $2 billion a year industry in the United States. We spend over $500 billion a year educating 50 million kids in the country, and we're spending $2 billion of that on tests now. So I think that is, Senator Ogden said, if that many school districts are concerned about something, then there's probably a reason to think there's a problem. Parental choice will no doubt be reviewed, and that's sometimes code word for the word vouchers. That subject, as you heard earlier today, will come up. Details were mentioned that we'll have to see what the details are going to be. One of the things that my friend David Anthony, who's here with Raise Your Hand Texas, and I've talked a lot about, and I know the Chancellor's been in on this discussion, it's something that we've talked about, is that a lot of people don't know there's a lot of choice within public schools right now. The Garland Independent School District is a complete freedom of choice school district. The Houston Independent School District allows students to enroll anywhere. The Lubbock School District probably has 8,000 or 10,000 students that attend a school other than their neighborhood school. There is, I think that's a lot that's not known about choice that's available right now. The argument is that a lot of needy children are trapped, that word trapped, in poor performing schools. I think that a closer examination would reveal that there may be more choice than people know. Teachers and teaching will always be at the forefront. I noticed the Texas Lyceum poll this morning that was released said that 74% of the Texans surveyed in their poll said they'd be willing to pay more taxes to increase teacher salaries. I thought that was kind of an interesting observation. Chancellor Monfort and I are on the Texas Teaching Commission. We've spent the last 10 months or so looking at teachers and the condition of teaching at Texas. I was very heartened to hear Chancellor Sharp say that Texas A&M is still paying close attention to its College of Education. Regrettably, one of the things that we've learned this year is that for the first time in Texas, we had more teachers certified this last year under alternative certification programs than we did under traditional teacher education programs.
Most of it, yeah.
Well, in your alternative program? Well, in any event, that is something that we have to pay close attention to. We have 340,000 teachers in Texas. About 39,000 teachers leave the profession each year for retirement or other reasons. We haven't been certifying that many teachers. We've been graduating about 17,000, between 15 and 17,000 teachers. We have more certificates being granted than that, but there's a clear disconnect in terms of those who are becoming eligible or certified to teach and the people that are needed. More importantly, the number of minority teachers is about 3,300 in terms of those that were certified. Number of math teachers, about 1,200. Number of science teachers certified last year, about 1,600 for the entire state. That is, I think, a real dilemma. If you look at the numbers of teachers, the baby boomers that are going to be eligible for retirement in the next 5 years, there is real concern, I think, in terms of who will teach. I will also say finally there's concern about 4 questions I always talk about in education. 1 is what will we teach? 2 is who will we teach? David Thompson's talked about that. 3 is who will teach, and I've just alluded to that. And 4 is who will pay. And that is also a concern because the fastest growing parts of our population Steve Murdoch has taught me is our over 55 population, our under 18. And the over 55 tends to be more Anglo and have more of the discretionary wealth and income, and the under 18 tends to be poor and more minority. And I think our state will be faced with the question that has to be answered, and that is, will the old pay to educate the young? And if we don't, are we going to like what we're going to see in 2030? Are we going to like the legacy that's going to be left? Big questions, no doubt. We've got some people here that have a lot of expertise in higher education as well as public education. I'm the only one that doesn't know anything, but we'll be glad to entertain. I'd like to ask Chancellor, I wanted to ask you, or David, let me ask you one question. I want to come back to Chancellor Sharp. Is there anything in the Constitution that requires that the state's required to do other than education?
You know, there are a lot of public services, if you look at the Constitution, that are authorized. But when you look at what are we required to do, where does it use that duty language? Where does it say the legislature has a duty to do this? The only place we use that in the Constitution is when we talk about education. There are many services we all use and appreciate, and I certainly am a supporter of those. But I think if you look at our state constitution, that is sort of interesting. We talk about education differently than we talk about other public services that we all appreciate.
I heard Chancellor Modford say something about be careful about regulating tuition. Chancellor Sharp, can you talk about tuition costs, how you feel about tuition? And we read so much about student loans and the numbers of students that have huge debt when they leave higher education. Where are we headed with the cost of higher education to the student with regard to loans and tuition?
Most of the extreme numbers that you read about in the paper take into account private universities and folks that are not necessarily in Texas, but that doesn't mean that Texas tuition hadn't risen dramatically since it was deregulated. I was asked the other day, was I for the freeze, where in other words a freshman would come in and you would know that that year you would pay for 4 years a locked-in tuition, and my answer was, you know, since I invented the Tomorrow Fund, which locked it in for as many as 18 years, I couldn't very well be against 4. So I think that's a reasonable approach for a couple of reasons. One is it probably takes pressure off when you ask the students who's locked in for 4 years, hey, would you be willing to increase tuition? They're going to say yes. And the second reason is that you can use it to up your graduation, your 4-year graduation rates, because you can say, this is good for 4 years. After 4 years, you go back to the other deal. And so all of a sudden, mom and dad are not too willing to let them go through one more football season just because they were taking 12 hours a year instead of the 15 or the 18 hours a year that many took, if not most took, back in the 70s and parts of the 80s. And so that's got to be a big part of it. And one of the things we have to do is get these kids through college faster. We've got counselors telling them, oh, you want to do 12 hours because if you do more than 12 hours, it's going to be horrible and all this kind of stuff. And so we're in the kind of process throughout our system of either changing counselors or changing attitudes with regard to how that works. Because the problem for that is that when you enter that 5th year, or much worse, the 6th year, there is some kid in high school that cannot get in one of these schools because somebody who decided not to, you know, really bear down is blocking your path in order to do it. Now, our tuition, our regents are taking this to heart. I mean, our tuition at the flagship at A&M is lower than University of Houston. It's lower than Texas Tech. I mean, obviously it's lower than the University of Texas. It is frozen, been frozen for 2 or 3 years. But the reason it is because, for instance, I mean, there's a lot of pressure among faculty and folks to increase tuition because they believe that's where their money comes from. That's where the raise is going to be. Well, the 3.6% tuition that was being touted at the flagship in College Station would have generated in the neighborhood of about $16 million we privatized 3 functions on the campus and generated $26 million a year for 10 years and got $45 million cash the day we signed the contract. And so it's difficult to tell us that there are not other things that can be done before you put the burden on the students. And we're not done yet. We think there's other things that can be done that won't reflect on them. And by the way, every single person that was outsourced has the same job that they had before. Every one of them were offered it. They all got a 4% raise. I mean, they're just simply working for another person. So all of the booger bear things that people were talking about were not there. But it is hard to do. You get much more political support by raising tuition because you're going to have the whole academy behind you saying, yeah, and you can get the students to vote for it. Oh, this is vital to the school. Okay, we'll vote for it. And they'll approve it, and the committees will approve it. And it's much more difficult to do the other. I can attest to you. I had 1,000 staff members calling me names my mother wouldn't appreciate at one time, you know, talking about outsourcing because it affects somebody. And so nobody does it. And we're quite confident nobody else is going to do it. And that's why at the end of this recession, we're going to have a whole bunch of professors and we're going to have a whole bunch of academy members that they don't have. And our #1 status as #1 research university in Texas is going to be ever closer to the $1 billion mark with the national level because we're taking those chances. But here's what we don't worry about. Poor kids, we've got scholarships for poor kids. There isn't a poor kid anywhere that we can't find the money to get them into school. We don't worry about rich kids because mom and daddy can handle that. Tell you who we worry about, middle class kids, whose mom and dad are one paycheck away from being poor, or losing a job or something like that. There are no scholarships for those kids if they can't run fast. There are no, unless they really got great grades or something like that, there's no scholarships for them. And those are the folks that wind up really getting zapped when you raise tuition because there's nothing for them to turn to, and they feel a lot of anxiety. And our whole charge at A&M is we're a land-grant institution. That's who we aim at. We're aiming at all of these kids that don't have opportunities or didn't back in the day to have an education. And so tuition is never going to be something that deters. We'll never raise ours so high that those poor kids, middle-class kids can't fit in. That's what we're about.
Very good. Before we turn, I ask for your questions. John, I'll ask you this question. You've been on both sides, most recently in the private sector. And you talked about the need for a qualified workforce, and yet you've been in the private sector. So talk about the private sector's expectations versus the private sector's appetite for additional support of higher education and public education.
Well, I think, we do, every company I've been associated with has to do their own OJT or their own on-the-job training just because it's become so highly specialized. But I think, well, for instance, when I was at General Motors, we had a void of new recruits coming in that were really talented engineers, design people, even business managers. So we set up the Buick Achievers Scholarship Program nationally, and we had a lot of debate and discussion about it, about our support of the industry and our support in, creating a pathway for new people to come into the auto industry. And I found it pretty interesting that we decided to give meaningful scholarships. I mean, I think they're pretty meaningful. There were $25,000 a year for 4-year academic programs and then 5-year for engineering, 5 years. But the thing that I appreciated about what we did is we didn't require them to go to work for General Motors. I mean, we were trying to really, I think, invest in the future of the industry. They go to work for anybody they want to. We also created another, and we gave, actually, I think annually we gave 100 of those, which adds up to a lot of money, but we didn't feel like that was enough. So we also chimed in with an additional additional 1,000 tuition scholarships that were available nationally. They weren't like a full ride like the $25,000, but they were to support tuition. So I think the point being, I think industry is very sensitive about the pipeline of people, the pipeline of talent that is coming into the industry, and I think that was a real step forward. We're not reluctant to invest in the future of our companies, and that's been true, I think, with 2 or 3 companies that I've been with. But again, the cost factor was so significant that we really had to extend a pretty meaningful scholarship, I think, to make a dent nationally. But that's my experience in industry. I think we are willing to invest, and we do invest huge amounts nationwide in a lot of college opportunities as well as community college opportunities. I couldn't help but think, listening to Chancellor Sharp, about what it would have been like to enjoy the largesse of the PUF fund. Having been at Texas Tech, I never got into that action because we were in the Higher Education Assistance Fund, I guess, which was created as sort of a mini antithesis or offset to the PUF money. So, you know, I would have loved to have that PUF money to spend. It would have been a huge addition. But all things are not created equal, and that's true particularly in higher ed. I never could understand, for instance, why A&M got 1/3 and UT got 2/3. There was some problem in the math, I guess, but of the PUF. I think that's the way it's divided. But I think all in all, Texas does a really good job in higher education. I mean, you know, again, you can sit around and complain about these things, but when you look at the opportunities we create, and it's really, you know, across the state, if you really go into every area, there's opportunities. So I hope we don't scale back, and I hope we continue to invest in the future of higher ed as well as public ed in Texas.
Very good. Questions? Yes, sir.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes, sir.
What are the litigants requesting in the suit that you're working?
What are we requesting? There are a couple of things you can't ask for. A court is not going to order the legislature to spend money. You know, so bottom line, that is not a remedy that will be sought. Frankly, we're asking a court to, the way it's always worked in the past, to be real honest about it, and both of these chancellors have said in the legislature at different times, and they can speak to this. The previous 6 lawsuits, it's almost been sort of a point counterpoint or call response between the legislature and the Supreme Court. And the court will tend to set out broad guidelines, and they'll say your system is defective in the following area. Here are some general comments on how it needs to be revised. And they will tend to do that as opposed to putting out a specific formula or say you have to, you know, the court isn't going to do that. Chancellor Sharp, I think, actually chaired the special effort last time that led up to the select committee, and he and I worked together quite a bit at that time. So the court is going to say broad principles. I do expect the court to say the system is unconstitutional. Frankly, I'm going to be very surprised if that's not a result. And then the court will say certain broad principles. They will say there's too much disparity between communities. You know, these communities have X amount of money, these other communities have Y, and there's no real reason why. Nobody can explain it, and everybody's being held to the same standards. They'll say that, or they could say that. They could say there is no connection between what it is you're trying to do and the means to do it. And however you design a system, those two things have to match up. That would be sort of a broad principle. They could say the system is so dependent on local property taxes that it operates like it was a state property tax, which is prohibited in our Constitution. And so you have to put discretion back in at the local level. Those will be the kinds of I think principles that you will hear from a court as opposed to the specific mechanical do X or do Y. And I will tell you, and I would be interested if either one of these folks want to speak to that. Just very candidly, I've never found a great deal of resistance in the legislature to this back and forth. In fact, I will just tell you, last summer, a Republican House chairman sent me a text from the floor of the House that said, "Please sue us soon." You know, so that sort of little nudge from the court, I think, is not always unexpected. And for whatever reason, that seems to be how we do business in Texas, and sometimes that judicial nudge is what allows us to do what I think most people probably would say and recognize we need to do anyway. So I think that's what we'll get from the court, are some broad principles. The details of it are very definitely going to be left to the legislature.
Yes, sir.
Given the national ranking of Texas public schools with regard to mean SAT scores, with regard to graduation rates, with regard to all those things, what is the resistance to trying something different? The limitation on charters. I would think that there might be a more open approach to trying something different, given the fact that the traditional teacher-centered bricks and mortar model doesn't seem to have served us very well, despite pretty good expenditures.
Well, can I respond to that real quick, Mike?
Yeah, then Chancellor Sharp.
Well, you know, first of all, by most national measures, Texas does get significantly above average results for below average expenditures on a national basis. One of the interesting things, if you look at our data disaggregated, in other words, how are our African American children doing? How are our Hispanic children doing? How are our Anglo children doing? And compare them to their peer groups in other states, we're in the top 2, 3, or definitely 10 in every single category. So people who say Texas isn't doing well, I think that's honestly a misuse of statistics. If you're looking at how Texas does vis-a-vis Iowa, we have a different population. I think our biggest problem in Texas is we have performance gaps between groups, and our growth as a state is in kids who don't tend to do as well. We do need to look at options. We need accountability. We don't just need to toss money off the roof of the Capitol, frankly, and you know, with no real idea of what's going to happen. But I think we do need choices. I think we need choices within that system of public free schools that the Constitution speaks to.
Chancellor?
I think you're getting enough charter schools now to where it is forcing the public to see the differences and stuff like that. I've just now started studying it. Our system actually is looking at all these charter schools now to see if we want to, quite frankly, get in the middle of that. But I will tell you this, and I don't mean to be disparaging of any other schools in the valley, but when those idea charter school kids show up in Corpus, in Kingsville, it doesn't take but a day to figure out where they came from. I mean, they are prepared. They seem to be the same socioeconomic deal. My presidents talk about that constantly, about, whoa, what in the world is going on with those kids? They know algebra. They know all these things. We don't have to have it. So something's happening there. I don't know if it's cherry picking. I don't know what it is. But I know that every one of my schools can identify those kids just like that. They know right where they came from.
I was Commissioner of Education. We put the first 20 charter schools in, and when we had the next group of charters, about 150 charters were approved. Charter schools, I think, David, about 125,000 kids, somewhere in that vicinity in this state. I don't think there's resistance to charter schools. I do think the problem has been there's been interest in lifting the cap. There's a cap of 215 on charter schools. There's interest in lifting that cap. I think the problem has been there's also interest in holding the poor performers accountable, just like we do the public schools. And the pushback has been that it's been very difficult. Instead of giving charter schools a a license, they got a charter which they've treated as a property right. In one instance, it's taken the agency 7 years, Texas Education Agency 7 years to shut down a charter. There are great charters like IDEA, like KIPP, yes. There are some wonderful charter schools, and there's some wonderful public schools. There are some poor public schools that get rated academically unacceptable, and sometimes they get reconstituted. Same thing needs to happen with charter schools. I'll have to align my comments with David. If you look at the number of students that are graduating from Texas high schools, 6 years ago, we had 239,000. The next year, 240,000. Next year, 241,000. Then we jumped to 252,000. Then we jumped to 265,000. This last year, we graduated 280,000. Those numbers are growing in terms of the numbers of students that are graduating from our high schools. SAT, ACT scores are difficult to compare. The whole time I was commissioner, and this continues to be the trend today, we're a state that has more kids that we're trying to get to think about going to college and therefore take the SAT and the ACT. The more students that take the test, your scores generally go down. We test 48% of our kids on the ACT. Iowa tests 5%. On the SAT, because Iowa's an ACT state. ACT headquarters are in Iowa. You really need to look at the percentage of students that are taking the test against the scores, just to simply say, well, Texas ranks this way on the SAT or ACT doesn't tell the entire story. You really have to look at the testing population. We need to do better. But I do think David is correct, and the story that's told sometimes is not complete.
Mike, can I give one statistic that, because we're here in Houston, I think I hope folks will find this interesting. Houston ISD, largest district in Texas, our district, we're in the middle of it right here. My kids went through Houston ISD. It is one of the top 10 districts in the state in terms of size. Hadn't really grown a lot in total population over the last 5 years. It's grown a little bit, but not much. High school population is pretty close to where it was 5 years ago. Last year, HISD graduated 2,000 more kids than they did 5 years ago. And virtually every one of them on a recommended program. So taking the same number of kids, more of them successfully making the move through the system to graduation. So there's always room for improvement. But I think our big struggle in Texas is a dramatically shifting demography. And Steve, I don't know if you've spoken to this. I think I'm going to get to hear you say it in the court that the only thing wrong with your projections a decade ago about how quickly our population was going to change was,
well, we were a little
because we underestimated how much our population is changing in Texas, and schools are where we see that change first.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
If you were to adequately address the funding issue for public school systems, would that take care of the problem?
I think you need a variety of things. I do think you need adequate funding, and by adequate, I'm not thinking pick a number out of the sky or the court, but a fundamental system that does start with what are you trying to accomplish, and do you have a system that's actually designed to accomplish what you set out to do? We need a system that's fair, or equitable is a word that tends to get used. We have a lot of different communities in Texas. We hold everybody to the same expectations. We do need to be efficient. We need to make the best use we can of the resources we have, and I think every day we need to look for ways to do that. And Chancellor Sharp, that may be looking at restructuring some of the infrastructure, privatization or outsourcing, or however you tend to do certain components. We always need to be more efficient. I think we need to do all of those things. Adequate funding is certainly part of it.
One of the things that Steve Murdoch's been yelling in the wilderness for about 30 years, and I think I don't want to put words in his mouth, but just one seminal feature of his publications, especially the Texas Challenge, is that if we don't do a better job of improving graduation rates, especially in Hispanics, the university, especially math, science, and engineering, we might as well turn off the light, the party's over.
There's truth in that. I would come back and say that money in the system is important, but how the money is spent is obviously important. And I'll say a word about teachers and teaching, because we've spent a lot of time on that this year on the Teaching Commission, looking at that. I'm from a family of teachers. Mother and father were teachers. Mother-in-law and father-in-law were teachers. Wife's a teacher. Brother was a teacher. His wife's a teacher. So I have a lot of affection for teachers. But as we meet with the teachers who are on the Teaching Commission with us, one of the things that I've said to them is, you need to let us help you reinvent your compensation schedules, because the idea of across-the-board raises for everybody doesn't work, and it doesn't help the profession. Teachers feel their morale's certainly been challenged as people talk about their retirement systems and talk about wanting to change their retirement systems or their health insurance benefits or those kinds of things. I think the teacher retirement system is a pretty healthy system. But the compensation systems and the idea that we're going to get more math teachers, more science teachers, more bilingual ed teachers, or more special ed teachers by paying everybody the same wage, if we're not able to convince them that the market does need to drive compensation schedules, I think it's going to be very difficult to get people to go to Texas A&M and say, I want to be a math teacher, I want to be a science teacher. When I was at Texas Tech with Chancellor Monfort, he asked me to go stand in for him at a political honors class, political science honors class he was teaching, and I asked the students, did anybody think about being a teacher? And one young lady raised her hand. I said, what's your major? She said, chemistry. I said, what are you going to do? She said, I'm going to be a chemical engineer for ExxonMobil. And I said, can you tell me how much they're going to pay you? And she said, $68,000. I said, how much would you have taught chemistry for in the public schools? And she said, oh, I would have liked to have taught if somebody would have paid me $50,000. If we're not willing to start changing our compensation schedules, and we've got to get the teachers and teacher organizations to work with us to let them help them reinvent the way we pay our teachers, so we can get the teachers. These dollars, more dollars make a difference. Yeah, they do. But here's, in my opinion, taxpayer dollars ought to be used to answer this question: who are the teachers that the children need? Who are the professors that the students need? Who are the teachers the children need? And we've got to get some changes made, I think, in the way we compensate teachers. And our teachers are going to have to, I think, be willing to work with us to accept some differentiated salary systems that are responsive to the market and the demands that we have for more math, more science teachers. That's not going to be easy, I know. Yes, sir.
Earlier you talked about alternative certification. There's more new teachers from alternative certification. You sort of hinted that it's a bad thing. Do we have data to say that?
No, it's a good thing. There are a lot of people that that my big concern about people that do that is they're staying in the profession. And really and truly, when the economy is not very good, we have a lot of people that want to teach, and that's okay. I hope they'll come. I hope they'll love on our kids, and I hope they'll stay in the profession. But we also, sometimes when things get better, it's a little bit harder to keep those individuals in the classroom with the kids. We have some great alternative certification programs. We also had some, when I was superintendent in Dallas, though, we had some people that wanted to just come and basically sign folks up and come say they went through a program and get them certified. That concerned me. David, were you going to say something on that?
No, I'm good.
Okay. Yes, sir.
You talked a little bit about testing. Can you talk about the balance between either national testing or statewide testing to evaluate the teachers, as opposed to the way most businesses, medical profession does, which is to have the supervisors evaluate and compensate those that work for them?
You want to talk about it? You want me to? Well, there's a lot of discussion about, again, should student performance, student test results be included in teacher evaluations. Actually, they are today in Texas. There's a requirement, but it's a very small requirement. I was charged with doing that in 1995, and I made student performance part of teacher evaluation, but it's on a very, very small scale. Today, you're seeing school systems like Baltimore, Denver, and others that are putting as much as 35 to 50% of the student performance on assessments or tests as part of the teacher evaluation. The problem you get into, my estimation, is we test in math, science, English, language arts, social studies, but what about the music teacher, the PE teacher? What about the art teacher? What about all the teachers that we have that don't have an attributable state assessment?
Foreign languages.
You know, foreign languages. I tend to be more of, one of the members of our commission is an attorney by the name of Mike Boone in Dallas, and is a principal in the Haynes and Boone law firm. And Mike and I have agreed that I prefer to evaluate and even compensate based on how the team does. How does the campus do in improving and growing student performance? Because I want all the teachers, even the ones that don't teach an attributable state test, be interested in the learning of every child in that school. If they need after-school tutoring, if they need more time, whatever it is. I think you're going to see a recommendation that student performance ought to be part of teacher appraisal, but you're going to see a recommendation from our commission anyway that there needs to be multiple measures in terms of looking at teacher performance. Again, this is part, in my opinion, of we have members of the 4 teacher organizations and 1 teacher of the year on the commission, and one of the things that we're trying to get them to realize is we're for them. We want them to be successful. We need them to be successful, but again, we need them to let us help reinvent with them, help them reinvent the way they're evaluated and the way they're compensated.
Can I ask a question?
You can answer it, or you can ask it and then probably get to answer it.
The McKinsey report, when you read that, it seemed to throw cold water on the 22-to-1 student-teacher ratio they have in Indonesia. Teachers that they pay the equivalent of $150,000, they may have 100 kids in the classroom. Is there something to that, or is there something magic about 22-to-1?
In this instance, I would probably, I don't know. David, you want to speak to that?
Sure.
Go ahead.
We have a requirement in Texas law that we put in 1984. It was something of a political point, not a research point, that requires basically kindergarten through 4th grade classes not to exceed 22-to-1. And it is more expensive to do that, obviously, John, as you know, than larger classes. And the research around that is probably not extremely strong. I will say teachers like it, kids like it, parents like it. And so to the extent that public schools are the public's schools, that's a legitimate part of the consideration. I think the research will say that there are some students, and I want to go back to our diverse population, there are some kids in our system that probably are just fine in larger classes. And there are some kids, and particularly our more at-risk kids, who really do need maybe classes even smaller than 22-to-1. They need more individualized attention because they're starting behind. And so I think a one-size-fits-all approach that keeps us from looking at honestly those needs may be not as, we may be kind of having an unintended result there. But
yeah, David, most research says you got to get to 1 to 15, but 1-to-1 is the most expensive. If you ask most parents, would you like 1-to-1? Well, what about 1 to 5, or what about 1 to 10, or what about 1 to 15, or what about 1 to 20? And obviously they'll like the smaller size you can have. There's no doubt that, and some schools are using, secondary schools that is, use larger class sizes with a lecturer, a master teacher, if you will, and may have teaching assistants or teaching aides, although that's not extremely popular either with parents. But the 22-to-1 is very popular in Dallas. When I was superintendent in Dallas, in our zip codes where we had the greatest amount of poverty and the largest number of economically disadvantaged kids, they needed the small classes. You could go to North Dallas, you could have kids in larger classes there and they could be successful. But David is correct. A lot of that just depends upon the economic status of the learner and the needs of the learner. I don't know that there's something that we can say works hard and fast, but it's more of the fact that the public and the parents and the teachers have become accustomed to that than it is that the research. I think research was, David, years ago, was 1 to 15 might make a difference, 1 to 14, 1 to 15, 1 to 16.
And there's also some indication that the more homogeneous the group of kids, you can be slightly larger. Because you can teach to the middle of the group and hit kids build around that, and the more diverse a particular classroom is in terms of where kids are, the harder it becomes to deal with larger classes.
Yes, question here and then here. Yes.
Technology. There hasn't been a lot of discussion about the role of technology. I saw a very interesting program where all of the students were given laptops and they would do the exercises at home, teach themselves at whatever pace worked for them, and then the classroom was used for them to ask the teacher questions instead of lecture. Can you speak about that?
I think it's going to continue to grow. After these two astute gentlemen left the Senate, I think I testified in 1997. We were spending about $600 million, $700 million a biennium on textbooks, on print, paper, and binding. And I pointed out to the legislature that over the next 6 years, that'd be about $2.1 billion. And I asked the question, is that where we want to spend our money, or do we want to start spending our money on technology? Frankly, the cost of the technology at that time was probably still too high to justify the change. I happen to think, and David probably have a even more informed opinion, that laptops, for instance, have really changed the dynamic. We couldn't wire all the classrooms and create all the wiring that we needed for every child to have a laptop in 1997. But the iPad is a game changer. I saw where the current Secretary of Education, I think yesterday, said that we need to move out of print, paper, and binding, and that students need to be getting content that's up to date. When I was commissioner, we still hadn't torn down the Berlin Wall in our social studies books. So that was an example that our content was really not current, not relevant. But I think it's only going to grow. I think the teachers as coaches via technology is going to continue to grow. David, you want to offer an opinion on that?
No, Mike, I think those are all good. I'll make a very quick comment. I think you're 100% right. Technology, and particularly devices like the iPad or whatever comes next, and there will be something, are allowing us to use technology in education. We need to keep pushing the envelope on that. Something you read about a lot in the public school environment, particularly in our more urban environments, is the so-called digital divide. How do you deal with the differences between families and kids who have access and families and kids who don't? And so I think that's something we've got to make part of the conversation, but technology.
The school paid for the
right.
Right.
You want to say anything about technology?
I mean, it is really exploding in universities. I don't know of
Yep.
any university that's not looking at it either from fear or opportunity.
Right.
But
Yep.
they're all looking at it, and it's very extensive in our schools, particularly at the graduate level right now. Got University of Houston Victoria, for instance, has more than half of its, 4/5 maybe, of its student body right here in Harris County in online centers, and that's going to continue to grow for a while. What's going to determine whether it works or not is what the employers say in the end, or the employer's going to like it. But most of our stuff is a blend of both of them.
My son wanted to go to School of Public Policy and looked at a couple of them. The chancellor doesn't know this, but he went to the Bush School of Government because they offered him a computer to come there.
I paid for that computer.
Did you? There was a question here, then one here. Let me get this one right here.
In looking at efficiency for public education, is anyone taking a serious look at the plethora of independent school districts we have in Texas? I haven't yet gotten over the shock I had 40 years ago upon moving from another state to San Antonio and finding in that county, Bexar County, there were 17 independent school districts.
Still are.
Which means, and there still are, that means you have elections that are enormously expensive, administration facilities and so forth.
I want to speak to that. When I was Commissioner of Education, I'd go to Bexar County regularly, and they'd meet with me and tell me they wanted me to help them consolidate their schools, and then I'd come over to Houston, and they'd tell me they want me to help them break up the Houston Independent School District. 1,100 plus school districts. Keep in mind that of that number, the 50 largest districts enroll 2.5 million of the 5 million kids. The 70 largest, or the 97 largest districts enroll 70%, or roughly 3.5 million of all the kids. Having spent some time in Lubbock with this gentleman, and I don't know how many school districts you had in your district, but the numbers of our large numbers of school districts are really generated in West Texas and small rural districts in West Texas, and to a smaller extent in East Texas. As East Texas has become more densely populated, it's a little bit different, but we do operate a lot of school districts. But these two gentlemen were on my right and left have been in the consolidation discussions before and can probably speak to the political fun that is. But the fear, most of these communities are fiercely protective of their communities, and I will say, and the Chancellor Montford might speak to this, it was very clear in West Texas when I was in Lubbock that to take away a community school was to basically say the community is going to die. And as far as districts like in Bexar County, and there's ongoing debate about are districts too large, are they too small, do we need to pull them together, do we need to break up Dallas, break up HISD? Those decisions are do we need to consolidate Bexar County districts? Those are calls that are tough calls. Y'all want to comment on those?
Yeah, I proposed a bill one time to have 254 school districts. It was the most fun I ever had in my life.
I think as Chancellor of A&M, you ought to propose that again.
I'd rather take on tenure than consolidating school districts.
Mike, can I just make
a
historical comment real quick? At the end of World War II, we had over 5,000 school districts in Texas. We had over 100 school districts in Harris County. A lot of people do not realize Cypress Fairbanks was obviously once, Houston ISD probably has pieces of what used to be 20 or more small school districts. In the 70s, we had 1,200 school districts at one point. We've got about 1,029 today, so it's very incremental. I think it is something that needs to be looked at. Obviously, any efficiency conversation needs to look at the structure of the schools. But as these two gentlemen said, I don't see many people in the legislature running to the front of the line to tackle that issue.
I can't remember if it was when I was commissioner, you were comptroller, but somebody did a look at how much money would be saved by consolidations, and it came in a lot lower than anybody. I mean, it was like $50 million or $100 million or something out of a $40 billion system or something like that. Well,
it was your report.
No, I didn't do the study. I was going to blame it on you. Yes, sir.
If you're interested in a site that talks about blended learning, even the vocabulary, because it's changing, it's a group called InnoSight, INNOSIGHT, and it's out of the Charter School Growth Fund, and they categorize what the charter schools and more progressive independent school districts are doing with computers, with student-centered curricula, and it's a tsunami that's coming. So they do the best.
I think one thing John mentioned over here about community colleges. I mean, universities gotta get off their little elitist perches and go work with community colleges and schools too. For instance, one of the things that we're doing that. We take more transfers than almost anybody, I think anybody. But we have to work real closely with those community colleges and make sure that when Joey signs up for that math course, that math course is going to transfer. Because heretofore, he winds up in all of these schools learning that it doesn't sometime his senior year, and he winds up instead of 60 hours, he's got to get 80, and it just costs a lot of extra money to do it. But I think universities also have a role to play if they're invited to be in school districts. For instance, this last Saturday, our Dean of Engineering and your school superintendent met to start talking about, in Houston, start talking about engineering academies. We're already doing some with Booker T. Washington and places like that, but getting really serious engineering academies and things like that and start exposing these kids to STEM courses at a much earlier age than we're doing now. And I think universities are only folks that can do that with resources.
Okay. Did you have a question? Or you have a comment?
I have a quick comment.
Or you want me to say it's over?
Well, no. What I wanted to say is that one of my other hats, other than demographer, was a rural sociologist. And there's been a lot of study. And it shows that when a small town loses a school, it does decrease and decline more rapidly. So when those people are fighting for that little school that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, they're really fighting for their community. And they're right, because once they lose that school, they lose the rapidity of which their small town declines in population is greater than it is if they keep it.
But consolidating school districts doesn't mean you lose the school.
Well, if you consolidate between two places, it usually means the high school's in one place versus the other, and where the high school is, where the athletic events are, that provides the place for the community activities. One other thing I want to say, just a comment, is that I've always had a problem with, is I do a lot of traveling across the state. I have for, I don't know, probably done 60 presentations for 35 years now across Texas, and I've been in almost every small town. But I keep running into these people where we need to do something about the disconnect between community colleges and four-year colleges. And I run into these people who have been fine stars in whatever the junior college is, and they find out that they've got a year worth of credits that go into such and such senior college because the senior college won't accept those credits. And sometimes there are things like, you know, basic math 101. And at some point, somebody in government or others has to come along and say, if we're going to accredit that junior college, and we say it's accredited, then I'm sorry, senior public college, you're going to have to accept those credits. Because we're losing students, a lot, particularly of poor minority students, who can't afford to take that other year over in order to get that four-year degree. And you just see it place after place after place. We need to get those two together.
Yeah, I think that's what Chancellor Sharp was alluding to, that there needs to be, the communication between those need to be very close. Any last questions? I want to thank all of you for your patience and going the distance this afternoon. Would you thank the panelists today too, Greg? Appreciate it very much. Dr. Murdoch, turn it back over to you.
You're gonna win.
Well, most of you are anxious to get on your way. Just say thank you for coming, and please give us your comments if you can. Thank you.